So this morning we have John Stevens here from Galileo. Thank you, John, for being up bright and early for this presentation.
Oh, sure. And thank you, Joy. Glad to be here. So we good to get started?
Yep.
Okay, great. So yeah, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. This session, hopefully you're in the right room. It's collaborating on accessibility and open access. And our little session description here. In this session, we're going to review two new committees this year that we have under Galileo, one on accessibility and one on open access. And we're going to go over these committees specifically, what they've been working on, how they formed and where they're going. With such a broad audience, there's also a lot in here that just goes over the basics of accessibility and open access and gives you some resources for context. So hopefully, regardless of your starting point or your interest in these two committees, you're going to find something that's going to be useful and interesting. So, and then I have to figure out how to advance the slide. Okay, so not to the useful and interesting part, but a little bit about me. I'm the Acquisitions and E-Resources Coordinator at Galileo, and my background is in ILL and acquisitions. As you can probably tell, I have not put on here that my strengths are PowerPoint design or in photography. But most of my time outside of Galileo is spent with these three little ones. So if you hear I'm on a call and you ever hear screaming in the background, it's probably me. But getting back to these committees, my background is in ILL and acquisitions, and that's where really my experience with both accessibility and open access comes out of in work with those. My first, real kind of hands-on work with accessibility was with 508 Compliance Committee back at one of my former jobs, and something that I've been dealing with increasingly over really the past 5 to 7 years, really, which I think is a situation that a lot of us are in. Right now, accessibility wasn't, a major reason I was hired. I don't think it was actually specified in the job description, but it's something that's become increasingly more important and something that's, really become important to my job. I've actually had it officially added as a duty to my duties in my position here, and have goals related to that for this coming year. So again, something that's become more important. Open access the same way. The world has been changing, and I know that probably most of us feel that we need to get caught up, know where we're at. So, a little bit of my personal experience coming into accessibility and open access that I think applies to all of us. We're trying to orient, where are we now and where we're going and how can we do that together? So to the together part of this, I wanted to give a little bit about Galileo in these contexts. And this is truly just a little bit about Galileo. Galileo does a whole lot and does different things from different people depending on your perspective. If you're in technical services, we provide a lot of those technical services. We provide content, we provide training. But another thing that we do is provide some strategic coordination on emerging issues. And that's really where the role that this falls under. So the quick history of this, a couple years ago, we started a committee under our steering committee. So Galileo has a steering committee with 20 odd representatives from each of our 7 communities. That steering committee decided that we could use an e-resources committee to help provide more input into that area that I manage, acquisitions and e-resources. And that committee has been very useful. A recommendation that came out of that committee was to have 2 further committees in the Galileo community to address popular issues, one on accessibility and one on open access. So those started this past year, and both committees had a lot of support. There's currently about 15 members on each. And you can see here down that link at the bottom, if once you get the slides afterwards, you can go here. Also, it is, of course, available through the navigation of our website. This is a little partial screenshot of that page. But that's just the brief history of where these come from, that we have a steering committee, and then we have an e-resources committee under that. And these 2 committees address issues that have been brought up as common shared issues that Galileo can play a role in coordinating. Now, taking a step back to these issues, well, what exactly are these issues? So, I'm not going to give this is not going to be comprehensive at all, but just to, give you a very brief touch of what we're talking about when we're talking about accessibility generally. even without using the word accessibility, it really comes down to universal design, a design that for things, now things isn't a great word. In general, I like to use a word other than things, but things is really just the broadest word. And that's what we want for universal design. Universal design does apply to all things, whether it's a product, an environment, any way that you interact with the world physically or virtually. But it is the design for things to be used, understood, and accessed by everyone. Now, as that applies to accessibility, that tends to be, governed here in the U.S. by the a few pieces of legislation, primarily the American with Disabilities Act, as well as sections 504 and sections 508, which apply to students with disabilities and access to online resources. And I've taken most of this from the ALA's GCLA chapter. You can find the link down there for a little further information. But that's just the broad context of what we're talking about when we're talking about accessibility. We're talking about different ways to make anything that we provide for our users accessible for all of our users. Now, that covers a whole lot, which doesn't apply so much specifically to Galileo. Galileo, we don't, have a physical library. We do provide some, services related to that, such as our courier. And of course, it applies to members of our community. When we're looking at accessibility from a Galileo perspective in this committee, we are looking primarily at it from a web accessibility standpoint. And for web accessibility, here I've taken this quote from the World Wide Web Consortium. You can see the link down there, which is a very valuable starting resource. It is a little bit overwhelming because there is so much good information, but it is authoritative and well organized, and time spent there is always time well spent. But here, this definition: the web is fundamentally designed to work for all people, whatever their hardware, software, language, location, or ability. When the web meets this goal, it is accessible to people with a diverse range of hearing, movement, sight, and cognitive ability. And I think that's a good perspective to take when we're looking at web accessibility. If we provide resources that aren't accessible to everyone, they are not fully functional. They're not fully operational. We are missing something literally if we have a resource that can't be accessed by everyone. So that's the perspective going into this committee, that we are looking primarily at web accessibility, but we are also looking at needs of the community. So while it's not necessarily just web accessibility, that is the primary context. Now here, getting to the committee itself. This committee was established with the primary goal here that it is to help ensure the website and content provided through Galileo are accessible with ADA and current standards for accessibility, and that the committee also assists in accessibility evaluations for library websites and locally licensed resources. So to put that another way, there's really kind of two aspects to this committee. One is the Galileo perspective on accessibility. This committee is really, to a great degree, helpful to me. It helps me make sure that we are providing what we need to for things that we manage. And it's also to help provide collaboration in the other direction, that for whatever needs there are locally, that we are helping coordinate those and meet those, because these are often shared needs. Even though we do all have different governance, we might have different interpretations and policies that we need to keep in mind. So what I do here at Galileo might not necessarily reflect what you need to do at your institution. Really the general needs and the laws that govern us all are the same, and the perspective here is to provide useful information to help reduce barriers to working on accessibility and to really reduce duplicated efforts. And the three main ways that we're focusing on that is to assist in assessments of websites that are provided through Galileo, as well as Galileo websites themselves, to collaborate on methods for local resource assessment, and to provide opportunities for training and discussion. And over here on the right, there's a little brief blurb. I've taken this from that section you saw before. It's linked on the next slide, but if you were to click and see the page specific to our accessibility committee, there's the description here, there's a list of members, and there is a recommendation for licensing language. That was one specific thing. I've used the word thing again, I'm stuck on it now. That is one specific thing that the committee wanted to recommend, is to make sure that everyone is, as much as possible, providing is really negotiating for a shared standard for licensing language regarding accessibility. And if you were to click through this, you can see that language essentially asking that our vendors take responsibility for accessibility and to meet current standards for them. Now, that was a brief overview of what the goal was and purpose for. Now getting to what more specifically we've done this year. So we have really covered a whole lot of ground over this past year. I feel like just really a tremendous amount for 12 months. And I really thank everyone who's participated. The first thing to do was to identify what exactly we wanted to do. We did have what felt at the time somewhat vague idea of what we wanted to do, but without actually starting the committee and seeing what everyone's goals were, it was hard to establish very distinctly what we wanted to do. So the first was to identify what the goals were, what the shared needs were of the committee members. And training and collaboration on evaluation were the two main goals that were identified. We also decided that at the time this was a new committee, there was no web presence. We do want you all to know that we are here. One way is through webinars like this. Again, thank you all for attending. Another way is making sure that you can discover us. If you've heard about an accessibility committee and we're not on our website, you will be like, well, hey, does this thing really exist? So here is that link I mentioned before on our website under the governance section. You can go there, see what we're doing, and that's something that we'll continue to develop. Placeholders isn't quite the right word, but we'll be continuing to work on that. Going back to those ways in which the committee helps me, this committee has helped me with completing an inventory of Galileo vendor accessibility. Now, we have kept accessibility in mind really ever since I've been here. We've had help articles within the website. We do check it licensing language. Since I began here and going back before that, it hasn't been quite as structured, I think, as it needed to be. So this year we did a true inventory of all the vendors we work with, looking at what is the state of their licensing language, asking for our preferred language wherever possible, making sure that we have current VPATs on file for all our vendors and doing at least a cursory check of those. Also making sure that they have accessibility statements, and if they don't, to request that they have them. And this is something where most of our vendors do. We do mostly work with large vendors who have entire teams on accessibility. But surprisingly, we did have some that didn't have accessibility statements. And we were able to get one. Ovid actually didn't have a public-facing accessibility statement, and they added one at our request, which I was very happy with. And in addition, this inventory also checks for independent testing. Linked a little bit later on, there's a resource for the Library Accessibility Alliance that evaluates academic resources. There's also a keyboard testing evaluation from University of Washington Libraries, which isn't linked here, but which I'll mention as is another great place for seeing if a third-party vendor resource has had some independent testing on its usability. And now going forward, currently in progress and going into next year, we're working on a LibGuide to help communicate best practices. You can see a screenshot of that over here on the right side of the screen. This one, the tab here, it's a work in progress. It's not published yet. It will be within the next couple of months. The tab here is the one on vendor accessibility, which is essentially describes that inventory that I just mentioned. Making some recommendations on that. The LibGuide will have lots of other information here. If you can squint, or even if you can't see this here, it'll provide an orientation, some guide to accessibility fundamentals, resources for training and testing and tools, as well as links to other areas related to accessibility. In addition to that, the committee is also working on a shared assessment tool, which is aimed at really, I would describe it as someone who has an interest in accessibility and a need to do accessibility evaluation without necessarily needing a whole lot of prior knowledge to be able to do that, which is a tough thing. It's hard to gauge, what should you do with accessibility? Accessibility, throwing it just a little bit of conventional wisdom out there, it's not ever really clear cut. There's no, this thing is accessible or it is not. There's level of accessibility. Nothing is ever truly going to be 100% permanently accessible or inaccessible. Everything's a work in progress. And I think there's always a need to make sure that you're doing everything you can, but there is so much to do that it's hard to get caught up and say there's so much to do, I can't even do everything. So we're working on an assessment here which is adaptable and can meet a wide variety of needs depending on what you're evaluating as well as the prior knowledge that you have. So a whole lot of information there. Now I'm going to shift gears into open access. And so this is, like I said, shifting gears, we're going to a different topic now. If you have thoughts about or questions about accessibility, please go ahead and paste them into the chat or hold them until the end. We'll get to those questions in about 10 to 15 minutes. So now running through the same thing with open access. Open access here, I feel, is a little bit more indistinctly defined. This here, there is no citation here. This is my own headcanon about how I organize my thoughts on open access. Because open access does mean many different things in different contexts. There's different sorts of open access. One I actually didn't even put on here, open access is even used sometimes to mean 24-hour access. So if you came here expecting information on 24-hour study areas, this is not what I'm talking about. What I am talking about is open access to primary documents, to books, to journals, end user content that traditionally we have spent a whole lot of money paying for, but increasingly this is being created either natively open to everyone or is being made or converted to open access from those prior restricted ways of opening content. So in its very most open form, open access really just means open content. It's anything that you can access without restriction. Now, of course, a lot of that isn't the sort of thing that we're really talking about in a library context. Someone's blog on something, without them necessarily being an authority on that. Social media, things like that are forms of open content, but not really what we're talking about here. But it's a gray area. Is something like Wikipedia, where does that fall? It is open content. At this point, I think more people consider it authoritative, but I think that's still a gray area. Google could be another one as well. Google itself, aside from linking to content, has lots of data, does have lots of resources. To what extent is Google? I'll go ahead and push that, mention that, just say that there is a lot of things that you could consider open, but then let's get to what I think we more agree upon is what is open access when we're talking about open access. So Galileo already participates in many ways and does a very good job of producing open access content. One sort of open access is things like the New Georgia Encyclopedia and the Digital Library of Georgia. This authoritative content that we're producing, which is things like encyclopedic material, digitization of primary resources, curated exhibits, which are meant for instruction and access to cultural heritage. There's that sort of open access, which we do, and we do very well, I think. Sheila over there at DLG does a great job, same with Ed Hatfield over at New Georgia Encyclopedia. So that's one sort of open access. Another sort of open access is open data, which is primarily government data at this point. There are getting to be more open access data sets that are from private or commercial companies, going back to Google. So Google could fall in this one too. Google has data sets on a variety of things. In a library context at this point, we're still primarily thinking about things like data.gov, data.georgia.gov. The census has its own data sets, things of that nature. There's another specific flavor of open access content, and that's open educational resources, which again, Jeff Gallant over there in Affordable Learning does a fantastic job there with open access educational resources. And then getting to the final one, which I've saved it for last because that is the one that we're thinking about a little more with this committee, is open access scholarly research. And we serve that to an extent with the Georgia Knowledge Repository. Now, the Georgia Knowledge Repository is the collection of repositories from participating members, which contribute records, shared records, that can be searched across institutions. There is deposition of faculty articles is definitely one sort of thing that is in there, which there is much of. There's also artifacts of institutional heritage, newsletters, department items and things like that. But there is a lot of open access scholarly research which isn't covered in Georgia Knowledge Repository. And this is really, I think everyone's at least a little bit familiar with open access scholarly research. This is open access journals, things like Archive and PLOS, things like open access monographs, which we're seeing at an increasing rate. So a very bit disjointed, bit unorganized. I feel like it is by nature a bit unorganized. We don't really have great firm definitions, but that's in general what we're thinking about in this open access committee. How do we organize all this? What are we doing well? How do we highlight what we're doing, or some of the issues here? So getting to what this committee specifically is doing, the Open Access Committee is to provide guidance on supporting the use and creation of open access resources within Galileo. It will also help assess current open access resources and policies and make recommendations to increase the utilization of open access materials. And so this goes on to mention that we have an initial phase of essentially fact finding and assessment of strategic goals. And from that, once we establish strategic goals, go into more firm specific ways that we can help with open access. And at this point, I see that being that we are going to do more with open access journal negotiations and perhaps with supporting purchasing for native open access publishers. That will be done to some degree within the committee, to some degree outside the committee as we work with our research institutions. This committee, though, will still serve a role in coordinating needs for open access and in helping us assess what we can do to support you locally in your own open access needs. And education, I think especially, will remain a large part of that. So again, as I did with the other committee, going through, and that's where sorry. Don't you love when you realize errors you made in your presentation? So skip that third point, I put it in the wrong one. But going over what we've done this year. So one, addressing what are the shared needs of open access? What do we need to do? For open access, it's a little bit different. The shared needs were to provide experience and training for the librarians. That was primarily what we wanted to do. Same thing with the Open Access Committee. We do want to make sure that people know that we're there, that we're findable, that people can participate if they want. Having a web presence for that is an initial step towards doing that. That third point, like I said, whoops, wrong slide. Fourth point, though, in that education vein, we did organize a webinar on a program called Fund to Mission from University of Michigan. We did offer this as an option for purchasing. The webinar itself was more oriented towards helping to understand how publishers are supporting native access to open access materials. So it was very educational. It wasn't actually all that sales oriented. I do, want to provide opportunities for supporting open access in this way, but even just from an educational perspective, it was very interesting. And also, as with the Accessibility Committee, we are working on a LibGuide for open access for resources that can be used, oriented towards both the public, towards authors, and towards librarians. And that one's a little bit further behind. We started that a little bit more recently, but that's another resource that I'll be sharing more about sometime in our FY23. So I just ran through a lot. Hopefully there's some conversations and questions. Hopefully it's not because I was so unclear that you have no idea what I said. But just as to start off here, I'll say, first of all, if you want to contact me about this or anything else, my email's here on the screen. For accessibility, just thinking about, taking a step back. So what is, really the goal? What's the point of here? For accessibility, I really see the role of this committee and the role of Galileo in general to reduce barriers and to help prevent duplicated efforts. As I mentioned, even though we're coming from different places, we're working with the same resources, we're working with many of the same restrictions. There's no point in doing assessment twice. There's no point in, there actually is a lot of point in all of us negotiating with our vendors and asking for it. But I do realize that we have a really advantaged role here that we can ask for things in our licenses. We can kind of shake the tree and get responses from our vendors where you might not be as successful locally. So again, that sort of reducing a barrier to help coordinating efforts is really the general role I see of the Accessibility Committee. For open access, the role I think is a little bit different. We're looking at increasing education and awareness, providing some strategic coordination, and providing support for what you're doing locally. And for all of these committees, I really want it to be as open as possible. You can come and join anytime. This is definitely a more the merrier sort of thing. Don't feel that you need any particular education or experience in either one to be able to participate and get something out of it. Don't feel that you need to commit to something. I know that itself is a barrier. You're like, well, yeah, this is an area of interest, but I don't want to sign up for a year. I don't want to attend every meeting. I am not a stickler for that. If there's any way that I can get you involved and provide something useful to you, I want to, again, reduce any barrier I can to doing that. So I'll go ahead and stop there. Let me check over the chat. And at this point, I think Joy has made it so that you can also unmute and ask questions.
That's correct. I was doing a lot of typing in chat, just commenting on what you were saying, but we didn't, and adding links to some of the things you mentioned, but everyone else, you feel free to type your questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourself if you have a question about either the two committees or the reasons for them, or what's next, or ideas that you may have for John. I'll ask a question. I'm wondering what aspect of these committees or these topics do you find the most challenging, John?
Well, I think for both of them, it's the fact that, again, in a way, they're like a little bit fuzzy. For some things, they're a lot of work, but you do have your work cut out for you. You know exactly what they're wanting to do. Accessibility is tough because you do have evaluation tools. The thing that really makes that challenging is that so much of evaluation is subjective. You can use things like there's something called Axe. There's other built-in browser plugins that you can use to check websites for accessibility. But we're sure AI is progressing, but we're a long ways from having that be foolproof. And really, for this sort of thing, I don't think we ever will. It's subjective things that you need to do, and you do need to put a lot of effort into. And it's really hard to get started on that, and it's something that you really have to do. So it's a tough part of accessibility, but again, that's the point of why I find this committee useful to that. So that we can share in this and help support each other. I will say, I hope that's a role that this committee will do too. If you know that you have an accessibility need, but you just know that realistically, you're not going to have the time to evaluate and you want someone to assist in that valuation, I'm very happy for you to send that my way and we'll look at that. And I'll go ahead and mention the same thing for open access. Open access is tough because, especially when you're looking at open access journal negotiations, for one, it's really still a new thing. I mean, they have been happening over the past 3 or 4 or 5 years, especially. But it's not really at the point where you can say, oh, this is how it's done. And it's something that's so unique based on each publisher, based on each institution, based on your research output, based on the data you have, based on your funding. It's not something where you can just do it once and then you know how to do it. It's truly a unique project every time you do it, which again makes it difficult. It's not just something where you get good at it and you're set. It's something that you always have to work on.
All right, thank you. Any other questions from people? Or are there any folks who are on similar committees at their library?
And Wendy just had a question. So related to open access, would Galileo consider adding freely available resources database to the Galileo platform? And the answer is yes. So we do have that already in there. So one way that we support linking to open access content is in Discovery. So our Discovery systems naturally link to a lot of the major ones, Directory of Open Access Journals, Directory of Open Access Monographs, Digital Public Library of America. Things like that are all going to be accessed, indexed in our Discovery systems. We also often link to specific databases based on a given need. A recent example is that many of our subscribers had access to Annals of American History through Britannica. That's a product that they discontinued, but it's a product that actually saw a lot of use, particularly at some of our K-12 institutions. And we knew that we would need something similar to that to fill that role. And I'll have to give credit to Russell Palmer. Since he did it, I don't remember what specifically the resource was, but there's an open resource that he found through DPLA that could fill that same role that we've linked to. So we're already doing that on a specific case-by-case basis. And that's definitely something where if you have recommendations for an open resource that you use that isn't indexed or linked through one of our database links, that is a great thing for us to look at and see if it's worth adding for everyone.
Sorry, I was typing part of that time. There was someone I was trying to get a message to in the chat.
Okay.
But thank you. Thank you for that. Any others? I'm still wondering if there are people who are on these sort of committees, if there are libraries and things that you all are looking at.
And I see E. Keithley. Yeah, I'd be happy. I do not know the next time I'll be around Fulton, but yeah, I'm always happy to have a conversation. I do most of my conversations virtually, but I'm happy to do in person as well. And yeah, I'm pleased to chat with anyone about any of these topics.
All right, everyone. Give it a little bit, few more seconds, see if there are any questions anyone has. You all can also unmute yourself at this point if you wanted to ask something aloud. Anne says, thank you for the presentation and all the hard work of the group so far.
Oh yeah, thank you, Anna. And I got to say, really, I don't do this, just because I want to do this. It is something that I think we need to do, but to a certain extent, these are things that I'm passionate about. They are, in a certain way, passion projects. I'm, like I said, always happy to talk about these. Happy for your input, and glad to see so many people participating and having interest.
All right, everyone is saying thank you, and I guess we will wrap it up. And the last statement she said was, it's great to love what you do. Yeah, definitely. I would agree with that. Well, thank you all for joining us for this presentation. And you'll be able to see the slides again and all the links that John mentioned momentarily on the conference platform. But I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference, and hope that it's been beneficial for you all thus far. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.